Okay, we'll make a start. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is the second in our series of webinars about Child of the North, the goal of which is to support the next stage of the development of the Child of the North initiative, which is a joint undertaking between the N8 Research Partnership and the Northern Health Science Alliance. My name is Stephen Parkinson and I am a Research Partnership Manager for the N8. If you joined us in the first webinar a couple of weeks ago, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. Thanks for joining. The purpose of these webinars is effectively twofold. Firstly, it's to hear from each of the universities in the N8 Research Partnership about the current range of research activity, both working with and for children and young people and families in their local areas across the North and beyond. We hope this will raise awareness of what is going on across our members and may also lead to new connections being made. But secondly, we also want to start a discussion about the how this ongoing activity can inform and support development of a future strategy for Child of the North, both as we emerge from the COVID pandemic slowly, and yet at the same time as we find further crises affecting our young people. We are due to have presentations today from colleagues from Lancaster and Liverpool, and I thank them for that, to tell us about some of their research and other activity underway at their universities. However, we also want you all to contribute as much as possible. So there will be opportunity to ask questions at the end of each of the presentations, and then we'll have an open discussion section at the end, in which we want to hear from you about what you think the priorities for Child of the North should be. I will now pop up the agenda. Bear with me one second. So, as I say, I will start with a brief introduction to Child of the North, and apologies for those of you who are here in the first session, you will have heard this before, but for the benefit of people who weren't here, I will quickly give a whiz through what we've done so far on Child of the North. Then we'll have a presentation from colleagues from Lancaster, and then a presentation from colleagues from Liverpool, and then we'll have the open discussion about the future strategy development. Before we kick off, just a couple of housekeeping items. We're recording the session. This is so that we can capture the discussions as fully as possible to help inform future strategy development. We'll also make the recording available afterwards in case anybody needs to drop off before the end. We're using the Zoom meeting format rather than webinar format. So if you want to ask a question, you can pop it in the chat or raise your hand during the Q&A. And likewise, during the open discussion at the end, use the raise hand function or again, put your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up from there. My colleague Nick is on hand to pick up the questions, and so we don't worry if it's a bit further up the chat, we'll make sure that it's not lost in the noise. So before we go into the presentations themselves, as I say, I just want to give a quick overview of where we've got to so far with Child of the North. So as I mentioned previously, Child of the North is a joint undertaking between the N8 Research Partnership and the Northern Health Science Alliance, the NHSA. We share as member organisations the 8 most research-intensive universities in the North. We also share common goals in advocating on behalf of our members and the North's research and innovation system and strengths, and connecting industry and academic expertise across the North. Child of the North also unites our common interest in tackling health inequalities and better understanding and drawing attention to the social determinants of health. So turning first to what Child of the North is, it was conceived shortly before the pandemic as a means of combining and elevating the huge amount of excellent and impactful research that takes place across the North in relation to children and young people and their experience of growing up in the North. As I'll explain in a minute, we sort of changed direction slightly once the pandemic hit, and this is a vision that we came up with really at the height of the pandemic for what Child of the North could do, which is to develop a platform for collaboration, high quality research and policy engagement that will improve the lives of all children living in the North in a post-pandemic age. So in terms of where we've been to date, Child of the North was selected as part of a process of priority setting by the N8 universities late in 2019. And it was done so in recognition, as I said before, of the sort of potential for critical mass of expertise across our universities and for genuine impact on a regional scale in issues relating to children and young people. As we hit early 2020, inevitably the pandemic meant that we had to pivot somewhat from our original aim, and we recalibrated our vision to an extent. So we now wanted to focus on what, as a collective of universities, we could do to help improve the lives of children in the post-pandemic age when that finally arrives. At the same time, we wanted to provide a focus in each institution for some of this activity and to help draw some of it together. And we nominated a group of what we're calling institutional champions, which is one to two key people per university to provide that key point of contact. As the pandemic wore on and the scale and the urgency of the impact of COVID on children's lives was becoming plain, it meant that we decided to pivot away from our initial idea of developing a large programmatic activity that may take several months, if not years, to develop, towards doing something that could respond rapidly to the crisis unfolding. And this led to the idea of producing a really impactful and timely report, which was the Child of the North report. And this represents the first output from the Child of the North initiative, and the purpose of us producing this was to come together to capture the impact of the pandemic on children growing up in the North and their experiences of it. In doing so, it also unavoidably looks back at the previous decade of austerity and the impact that that's had on lives of children in the North, the inequalities that it's highlighted, and how the pandemic has further exacerbated these existing inequalities. So the report represents the work of more than 40 authors from across not just the N8 universities, but the Northern Applied Research Collaborations, other Northern NHS trusts, the Bradford Institute of Health Research, other universities including Bradford, Imperial and Oxford. And our lead authors were Kate Pickett from York and David Taylor Robinson from Liverpool. As you can see there, the scope was quite broad in terms of the areas that we looked at. And we wanted to emphasize how vital it is to keep the voices of children and young people themselves at the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic recovery strategies and the levelling up agenda. So with this in mind, the report makes plentiful use of case studies and stories to foreground individuals' experiences and best practice policies and interventions that can be used. Although the time and space constraints meant that we couldn't devote chapters to all groups of children and young people who might have special or additional needs, the policy recommendations we devised we felt were broad and deep enough that if enacted in a timely fashion and at scale, they could improve the health, well-being and life chances of all children. Turning briefly to the report findings, the key message of the report is that the pandemic has only exacerbated the pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities that too many children in the North face. And we came up with a total of 18 recommendations across all those areas covered in the scope on the previous slide. We were, however, conscious throughout writing the report to avoid painting a picture of Northern exceptionalism. We recognise that the vulnerabilities and inequalities found in the North also affect children in other parts of the country, in fact, across the country. However, our argument was that through looking at the picture of the North as a whole, that a clear picture emerges of those inequalities and vulnerabilities faced by children in the North. So in simple terms, the bottom line is that we think children in the North get a bad deal. Higher levels of poverty, a lack of investment, and a series of lopsided policy choices mean Northern children are more at risk of a range of adverse health and well-being outcomes than their non-Northern counterparts. And we believe that if levelling up is to work, it must address these issues. So turning now to where we're going next, following publication of the report at the end of last year, we held a parliamentary launch event in March this year, which was hosted by Liz Twist, who is the MP for Blaydon, and that was attended by a number of Northern MPs, including Bridget Phillipson, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Emma Law-Buck, Kim Ledbetter, Andy MacDonald, and others. One direct result of that parliamentary launch was a proposal to set up a Child of the North all-party parliamentary group. The purpose of the APPG will be to hold inquiries looking in more detail at issues raised in the Child of the North report, starting with the current cost of living crisis. So the first meeting of the APPG and the first evidence session looking at the cost of living crisis is scheduled for next Wednesday, the 19th of October. At the same time as this, we're now looking, as I said, to develop a future strategy for Child of the North that ties together areas of both research and policy engagement, including the work of the APPG, to provide a focus for the Child of the North's future activities. So thinking about that future strategy development, this brings us back to the purpose of these webinars. If we want to develop this strategy, and we're keen to do so, we first need to have a greater shared understanding of what each of us is doing across our universities and where the potential points of connection and our collective strengths lie. So through these webinars, we hope to build up a picture of these strengths, which in turn will inform the development of the strategy. We are ultimately planning to hold a workshop in the new year to agree on the elements of this strategy, building on the outcomes of these webinars. So the key question in terms of the future strategy is to identify where the greatest additional benefits of us working together lie, or to put it another way, what is it that we can do collectively that we can't do alone? And we recognise that it cannot, as I say, be about research alone. Enhanced policy advocacy and engagement is a key asset of our working collectively together. The other key thing to mention, and I'd like to hopefully get onto this during the conversation today, is that there's an opportunity here to make a case for the N8 to invest to build and sustain capacity in this area. So ideas for how we might invest on a sort of pump priming basis, how we can make that case to the N8 governance, and what we think should be aspects of that initial capacity building. Would be great to have a conversation about that. So in terms of the topics for discussion, particularly at the end of the session with the general discussion, I just want to put these out here. We'll put them again in the chat when we get to the open discussion, so you don't have to remember them, so that they'll be there. But just to focus on your questions, obviously this doesn't limit what you might want to discuss, but just some ideas, thinking about the proposed aim of the future strategy, which is to support recovery from the pandemic and related shocks for children, particularly the most disadvantaged growing up in the north of England. What is it that you've heard in these discussions today that could form part of a future strategy? What do you consider to be the most pressing priorities for the N8, NHSA and others across the north to work collectively on? But also what barriers exist to our working collectively and how we might overcome them. At which point I will stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to pass over now to Gert and Uta from Lancaster to give their presentation. Just to say a few brief words before we do so, just to introduce them. So Professor Uta Papan is Professor of Literary Studies in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster, and she's also the co-director of the Literacy Research Centre. And Gert Westerman is Professor in the Department of Psychology and is also head of the Developmental Cognitive Science Lab, which forms part of the Infancy and Early Development Group. So Uta and Gert, over to you, please.
Thank you. So I'm sharing, you can probably see my presentation now. Yeah, does it work? Good. Yes, so thanks. So Uta and I today want to give a brief overview of the projects and people at Lancaster University relevant to Child of the North. We basically sent out a call among the people who have signed up to the Child of the North topic in our local teams that we have for projects that they think would be worth mentioning here. So this is by necessity a subset of everything that's going on here. But it's already so much. We had a good return that we can only give a very brief glimpse, of course, about all these topics. So just to say, at Lancaster, there were about 40 people around the university who've expressed interest in being involved in the Child of the North across the range of the departments that you can see here: psychology, health science, medical school, linguistics, sociology, law, and the Lancaster Environment Center as well. Uta and I are the institutional champions here, and the other key people, or some other key people, will be mentioned as we go through the projects that we have. Just see how I can forward this. So just to say a few words about our key infrastructure and investments, just two examples here. So we have the Health Innovation Campus, a relatively new building, which is developing. It's still developing for its exact purpose, but it's a physical hub which brings together like academics, industry, research partners, healthcare providers, and so on. So a kind of a switchboard in a sense to link the external world to the expertise within the university. And then in our department, the psychology department, we have the Lancaster Baby Lab, which is one of the largest research facilities in the world, in fact, for the study of infant and child development. So we've got a lot of different equipment to test infants and young children, and a lot of expertise, both behaviorally with eye tracking and neurophysiology. So key projects and people. So first I want to say something that I, in a sense, initiated around the N8 universities, which is the Child of the North subtopic, the first 1,000 days, because traditionally, studies on increasing the well-being of children have focused on slightly older children, but also in the past few years, it has become quite apparent that the first 1,000 days, which is basically roughly the time from conception to second birthday, is perhaps the most important time in a child's development in terms of plasticity and laying the foundations for later development. So there have been UNICEF reports that you can see here. House of Commons has also woken up to this in a sense, the first 1,000 days of life, and policy papers are coming out now. Sometimes it's the first 1,001 days. So I basically sent a call around the N8 universities, and so far we have 27 people signed up to this. We haven't done much yet with this topic, but in a sense we have established a network of people who study basically children up to 2 years of age, so we can combine forces. The next is our ESRC Center for Language and Communicative Development, LUCID, which is in its 8th year now. It's a center grant between Manchester, Lancaster, and Liverpool universities, involving international partners, advisory boards, impact boards. So we have impact and outreach as well, of course. The focus of the center is to study language and communicative development from very young, like 6 months or lower of age, reaching into early literacy, like 7-year-olds. The PI is Julian Pine at Liverpool and Anna Theakston at Manchester, and I here at Lancaster are the co-directors. Here you see a list of the Lancaster people who are involved, and yeah, you can contact me if you want to know more. Just to go through a few of the relevant topics that we study in this LUCID Center here at Lancaster. One was the language 0 to 5 or 0 to 5, or now 0 to 7, because the center's in its second installment. Really intensively testing children across this age range and filming them in their home setting as well, to investigate the transition from preschool oral language into early literacy and the factors that impact on this development. Also, there was a study on the effect of COVID that is being continued to investigate how this has changed for children at different preschool settings, and the impact of COVID on oral literacy development. The people at Lancaster involved are Patrick Monaghan, Kate Kane, and Lana Jago, and you can get in touch with Patrick if you want to know more. 2 more topics. One is that I've been leading the causes of developmental language disorder. So with my postdoc, we did some study computation modeling, in fact, as well, to show that working memory deficit, which is often taken to be the underlying cause of developmental language disorder, is not necessarily that, and we might have to look elsewhere. And this has had positive echo in the practitioner field, because interventions focusing on working memory just don't work. So we need to find different ways in which we can help children with DLD. Silke Brandt, who's also in this call, I think, she works on theory of mind development and linguistic development. Theory of mind, the ability to understand other people's perspectives and knowledge states, predicts academic success and the ability to form friendships. And her work suggests that development of this can be supported when children are through the language environment that is provided to children. And another project which we're currently preparing, so we just put in an application for this to the Nuffield Foundation, is to understand better the effect of adverse prenatal experiences by the mother on the long-term educational attainment of the child. Kirsty Dunn, my colleague here in the psychology department, is leading on this, and I'm co-I with someone from Warwick. And Peter Timms, he kind of initiated this question at Durham, and there were Riley from Durham as well. So they are on our advisory board. Initially, we need to pull together the evidence that we have so far. So we want to conduct 5 systematic reviews of these different effects of these adverse experiences here. We know, of course, a lot about, for example, alcohol. We know much less about the effect of maternal stress, for example, on outcomes. So there's a lot of work to be done here. Then Patrick Monaghan, my colleague here in psychology as well, he's working with Gemma Taylor, who's leading this at Salford University, studies about preschool children's use of media devices, like as they do so much now, and the impact of this use on children's language, emotional, and cognitive development. So we can get in touch with Patrick about that. Kate Kane, also my colleague in psychology, is involved in several projects. One is an EU ITN, early language development in the digital age, where she has 2 work packages studying semantic learning for typical age-level populations and contrasting how well children can understand and learn from digital versus analog learning materials. And in another study, related study, she's looking at how children engage with digital reading supplement tools in the US in this case. So the question how children engage with technology and the outcomes on their learning and cognitive development. Sorry. Then I think, I hope I didn't skip one. No. So my colleague Amy Atkinson in the Department of Psychology, she's, I think she's also in this call. She's asking the question if the school readiness predicts later academic achievement. So there's the early years foundation stage profile that all children at the end of reception do. And she found that the outcome of this can identify children at risk for poor academic achievement several years later, and thereby identify children who need special education or need support. And she's extending this currently to look 6 years into the future from this, so at the end of primary school, if this reception test can still predict outcomes 6 years later. So get in touch with Amy. She's working on this with colleagues in Leeds, York, and the Center of Applied Education Research, if you have questions about that. And here I hand over to Uta. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just briefly, why don't you keep it, and I'll tell you when to move, because then we don't have the faffing with sharing screen again.
Sure.
So I'm going to briefly talk about a range of projects in the area of health and relying here on what colleagues have shared with me. So the first one here is the Children's Health Inequalities Research Project, which was commissioned by the Children's Hospital Alliance. And as you can see, it was intended to carry out an England-wide piece looking at the role of children's hospitals in addressing health inequalities. And the main contact person here is Rachel Isbar and a couple of other people in the department. Then there's another important project which is looking specifically at the impact of the pandemic on children's brain tumor, a mixed method study, but with a very large component where the intention and design is to make sure that the voices of children and young people and their parents and carers are really brought into the study. And it's funded by the Action Medical Research. Contact again, Rachel. I'm sure that the slides will be shared, so we put the contacts and email addresses on there so that you can get in touch with people if you want to. The next one, please, Gert. So another study, which I think Rachel is still involved in right now, is about vaccination update amongst under 5s during the pandemic. Has been done in Manchester, and the results are being translated into clinical practice. There's then the intention to scale up the findings and the implementation across Greater Manchester, with the hope of increasing the uptake of the MMR vaccine specifically. Again, the contact is Rachel. Another important study that's being done by Hannah Stewart at the moment is about health inequalities that affect children with hearing loss. I'm sharing here information about an area that I don't know anything about, so I hope I'm adequately representing what Hannah, what she's doing. So it's about the issue that children with mild to moderate hearing loss, that they don't necessarily get the same kind of benefits from hearing aid algorithms than adults do. So they don't really benefit in the same way from advances in technology in terms of improved hearing. And there doesn't seem to be any current policy on this. So a grant proposal is in development to try to explore this issue and to try to see how advances in hearing technology can benefit children, for example, in classroom contexts. Next one. Thank you. Another study in the area of health is about the health needs of children in year six and 9, so in primary and in secondary school. The focus is here on identifying what are actually the risk factors of adverse health and well-being outcomes. It's done in the Lancashire region, will inform commissioning decisions in the Lancashire region, and might be, disseminated, and hopefully, I would say, will be disseminated across a wider children and young people's public health agenda. Next one. So this is a project which is something I have been involved in with colleagues in the Lancaster Literacy Research Centre. We've done a pilot project and consultation with students in Lancaster about what we call students' creative mental health literacy practices. This is about practices such as, reading fiction, creative writing, creating multimedia products, drawing, painting, anything, poetry. And we came across this through prior research by one of our colleagues, where she found that this is an area that is actually relevant to students, and that students, in a sense, use such creative strategies to help themselves dealing with stress or anxiety, or even dealing with tougher issues relating to their mental health. And obviously, as you probably all know, that student mental health is a growing area of concern. So we are at the moment in the process of developing a grant proposal for the AHRC. And the next one, please. Growing up in an uncertain world, understanding children and young people's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges and their impact on their present and future lives is something that Caroline Bond and Pamela Qualter, who are both in the call, and I can see both of them, and I have developed as an idea, as a plan for a collaborative, co-created research project with young people and children earlier this year. And it's really emerged out of the knowledge and understanding that not just the pandemic, but other things that are happening right now in the world and in young people's lives, including the cost of living and the energy crisis, the climate emergency, the war, are affecting young people and children on an everyday basis. And that, we need to know more about how they are actually dealing with this and managing the impact of these events on their lives. So we developed an initial proposal for a bit of pilot work in just, a relatively small number of going through schools and working with a relatively small number of children and young people, with the idea that this could then feed into a larger grant application. Next one, please. Just a little bit more about the Lancaster Literacy Research Centre. So this is the centre I'm part of. We have a relatively small centre. We have a different, perhaps a complementary and different approach to understanding literacy, to more psychologically oriented research. So our approach is to think about literacy as a social and cultural practice, as something people do in everyday life, but also, of course, in education. One of the projects that is relevant to the NA Child of the North, and that's currently happening, is the project that's called Toddlers, Tech and Talk. And it's the person involved is my colleague, Julia Gillen. It's run by Rosie Fluid from Manchester. And it's about young children's language and literacy learning in the context of how at home they engage with and use digital technologies. Next one. And I think this is probably the last one, isn't it? So here's another really interesting education-related project by Marguerite Grown in the Department of Psychology. This is about understanding or increasing our understanding of the role of morphological awareness and knowledge in how children make sense of what they read, so reading comprehension. And it's looking at secondary schools. There are also several other projects. Marguerite and other colleagues, including Kate, are involved in looking at children's cognitive and language skills in relation to how they learn to read and how they comprehend what they read. So I think that's it, Gerd, isn't it?
It is.
We've tried our best to do this in the time given. We probably haven't completely succeeded. Thank you, Gerd, for helping with the slides.
Thank you.
As I said, I assume, Steve, that you will share the slides later, so you can ask questions now. I think some of our colleagues are hopefully in the call so that you can ask them, but also you can contact them later.
Yeah, many thanks, Uta, and yes, as I say, we will circulate the slides afterwards. But yeah, a big thank you to you both. You did very much keep to time, and really appreciate you particularly picking up projects by colleagues that you, as you say, that aren't your own projects. That's really useful to give a really sort of wide-ranging view of what's going on at Lancaster. Do we have any questions for Gert and Uta about anything in their presentation? Silence. I can't believe there isn't anything that somebody wants to ask.
I think that's Pam.
Yeah, I just have a really simple question, really, I suppose. So there seems to be quite a bit of collaboration going on across the N8 universities, which is really nice to see. Is that something that's come out of discussions like this, or is that something that was naturally going to happen anyway because you were meeting each other at conferences? It's just a query, really, because we're finding that making those collaborations is slightly harder for staff at Manchester.
Yeah, I could talk about the Lucid Centre. That actually predates the Child of the North. We started that in 2014 with Manchester and Liverpool. And that was because, well, we just saw the synergies for researchers in language development in these two universities. And we had a second bit where we also wanted to include Sheffield. But it was kind of from that perspective, researchers knowing each other and their work.
I think my experience is actually slightly different, Pam, because, for example, in the Literacy Research Centre, most of our contacts are a bit more international, and a lot of our work is actually international and not based in the UK. So I've not necessarily always found it so easy to find collaborators locally. I mean, we do have some, no doubt, but yeah.
Maybe just to follow up again, this first 1,000 days topic was my idea to use the Child of the North to bring together people. And so often everybody's very busy in the stuff that they already do, but well, we have now a network. At least we know who the people are, and we have a team for the first 1,000 days. So if things come up, we can use that. But to be honest, we haven't used it much yet. But it's basically, well, we share our common expertise in this field.
Okay. I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier about Pom, it'd be really interesting to have people's thoughts about how you go beyond that, as you say, that initial sort of bringing a group together around a common interest to actually what you need to go on to the next step, given that, as you say, everybody is quite so busy, to sort of give them the incentive to go on and grow that. So yeah, it'd be interesting, some conversation and some reflections on that later if possible. Any other questions for Gert before we move on? Okay, well, if anything springs to mind later, obviously we can bring it up during the general discussion at the end. But otherwise, I will now ask Helen Stolford from Liverpool if she's okay to start her presentation.
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm kind of just recovering my voice after having lost it for a few days, so I hope you can. Hope I get through this and that you can hear me. I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Oh, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So I thought I would. We've got I think two slots on this. So we've got David Taylor Robinson, who's going to be presenting at the next workshop, looking specifically at some of the health related research that we do, because he's much more qualified to talk about that. I thought I'd talk a bit about the humanities and social science research that we do, and some potential as well as existing collaborations. But I thought I'd sort of start with a bit of context around how children in childhood is supported by our institution, and how we've really been trying in the last few years to really get our house in order, the kind of fundamental building blocks for good children in childhood research. We're trying to get all of that in order. So children in childhood is part of one of 3 university themes as part of its Starting Well, Living Well and Aging Well theme. And that has traditionally been very much focused on the health of children, both kind of pre and post birth and early years. But we've really extended that in the last few years to beyond health. And that's been a really good platform for kind of forging cross-disciplinary collaborations across all 3 faculties. But in our own humanities and social sciences faculty, children in childhood was established as one of its discrete research priorities back in 2017. So, and I lead on the children in childhood theme for our faculty. So again, what we've been trying to do is kind of map what everyone's doing across the faculty, as well as across the university, but really trying to identify those intra-faculty kind of research collaborations and synergies. Across our university, we've got between 100 and 150 researchers working on discrete projects around children in childhood. And we know that there's still quite a lot of work to be done to try and forge kind of those collaborations and get the most out of them within Liverpool, never mind across the N8. We've been back in 2017, we also established a university level young persons advisory group. So we know that lots of different projects have their own little young persons advisory groups, but we've established a university level one that has of a pool of between 20 and 30 young people between the ages of 13 and 19 who advise, who help us kind of set the agenda for our projects, not just help us answer questions, but help us to identify what those questions should be. And they meet about once every month. We were meeting face to face, but we meet online at the minute, and they're all paid £10 an hour for their participation in that. They're all trained up and they're recruited from a whole range of different backgrounds. And we have a kind of annual showcase around our young persons advisory group. It's become one of the most kind of fulfilling things that we've done under our research themes, just because it has a massive impact on the young people themselves being part of that group, as well as a massive impact on us, consulting with them from the very outset, the very conception of research. We also felt pretty strongly that we shouldn't be consulting with young people from a kind of middle-class white background about projects that were related to child poverty or ethnic minority issues or whatever. So we're quite careful, discerning in the way that we select different groups for different projects. And so that's been really good. We've also developed one of the kind of key sticking points, and I'm sure this is shared by others, was our very risk-averse ethics process and ethics committee. We've really found over the years that if we wanted to engage with vulnerable groups, the kind of ethical approval hoops that we had to jump through were just such a disincentive to doing any kind of meaningful research, and we've really tried to push back against that. And we in law and social justice have developed good relationships with the ethics committee, but many earlier career researchers from across the university are just not doing that kind of edgy research that they should be doing because they just can't navigate the ethics process. And what we did find as well is that the guidance around ethics and the ethics templates around kind of consent and all that sort of stuff, they were very adult focused. And so we took it on ourselves because we know that there's an abundance of guidance and good practice around sound ethical research involving children that just weren't necessarily being brought to bear on our ethics decision-making processes within the institution. And when we tried to interrogate how much training and experience our own ethics committee had in kind of children and childhood research beyond a particular discipline, it wasn't always dead apparent that they had more experience than a lot of the researchers applying to them for approval had. So we've tried to forge a much more constructive relationship with our ethics committee, and we've developed our own bespoke ethics briefings around how you develop or what you need to think about if you're putting in an ethics application to ethics committee around children and childhood research, and particularly around things like the kind of default position of having to get parental consent to engage with children under the age of 16. And we've really pushed back on some of that and said, look, a lot of our research is about children's relationship with their parents. It's about children who don't live with their parents. And in my case, unaccompanied asylum seeking children. And so we really pushed back on some of that and kind of outlined the law that you've got a child who can go in and have contraceptive advice and treatment. They can go and get an abortion without even their parents' knowledge, but yet we have to go and get parental consent for them to even talk to us as researchers. And so we've been trying to sort of navigate some of those really tricky questions around just even doing the research and framing it as unethical in and of itself to restrict research for certain groups, and saying that that's an ethics kind of challenge in and of itself. So those ethics briefings are going to be published on the National Council for Research Methods platform and freely available at the end of this month, actually. And we just want, and they just basically signpost researchers to the best sources of information around ethics and give some templates about how to write a good information sheet, consent form, that sort of stuff for research involving children. We've also been working on a new online series. It's an international series on how you bring theory to bear on children and childhood research. And it was really in response to a vacuum in the sort of theoretical work on children and childhood. So how do we kind of bring feminist theory to bear on children and childhood research, or vulnerability theory, or Marxist theory, or theories of power? And we developed this kind of online series of experts, international experts in the field, explaining the theory, unpacking it in sort of more accessible ways to people who were new to those theoretical frameworks. And then the second part of the series involves a kind of a dialogue, if you like, between a researcher working in children and childhood with a theoretician, sort of trying to unpack how they would apply that theory to their research in practice. So it's a real sort of demystifying theory sort of series, and that's available online. We're building on the series gradually. We've got 3 up there so far, and they're just a really useful resource with kind of these are your starter reading resources if you want to get into this particular theoretical perspective. Across our university, we've got already really signed and fruitful cross-disciplinary collaborations between various departments. We also know that there's massive potential for further collaboration between economics and law, economics, social sciences, and civic design. There's a whole body of work on children's involvement in designing space at Liverpool. I just thought I'd give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the work. I don't claim to know all of the details of all of this work, but these are some of the most prominent pieces of work. So quite a bit in the kind of COVID context, Simeon Yates in comms and media, as well as other colleagues in geographic information science and development economics, have been doing work on digital inequalities, and particularly how it's affected children in the pandemic, and how the pandemic has exposed and compounded those digital inequalities and the kind of legacies of that. And they're really now working on some follow-up projects that's trying to develop a minimum digital living standard for UK households with a focus on children's access to digital resources. And so it's trying to move beyond the kind of very basic indicators of digital literacy and health that we've been working with. We've also got a big project called Stay Home Stories, that's led by Georgina Enfield in geography, in collaboration with Queen Mary London and the Royal Geographical Society and various museums. And they've been mapping how children experience and practice home, both during the pandemic, but also the kind of legacies of that. So they've been looking at really difficult issues around domestic violence and isolation and mental health, and depicting that through some really, really beautiful kind of creative methods. So I presume that these slides will be circulated and you'll be able to click on the link to some of the resources, but really trying to kind of learn some lessons as we move out of the lockdown phase. We've got a whole body of work on food marketing and childhood obesity, and some really interesting collaborations between psychology and law. How do we really use, how do we really understand children's eating behaviour and the relationship between marketing, corporate responsibility and childhood obesity, and how do we use the law as a tool to attack that kind of marketing freedom. So there's a whole body of work being done by Amandine Guard and Emma Boyland, as well as various others here at Liverpool. We've got a real kind of whole body of expertise around immigration, modern slavery and unfree labour. So we've done loads of work on the impacts of Brexit on children's immigration status, on their nationality status. We've done lots of work on British children's access to British citizenship. We've done a lot of work on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and other vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers and victims of trafficking. We're doing quite a lot of work now on deportation and the deportation of foreign national offenders and the impact of that on children, and how we can pursue better welfare testing so that the welfare of children can be taken into account when we're deporting people to Rwanda and that kind of thing. There's a significant amount of work being done with UNICEF and FIFA on unfree labour and the football industry and how children are treated within the football industry, and that's been transposed into some really brilliant guidance for football clubs on how to work beyond safeguarding in a football industry context to empowering children and making sure that their well-being is served beyond their football career. We've done a lot of work on the supply chains and modern slavery in the supply chain, some really interesting work around the supply chain to the chocolate and clothes industry, been to the Dominican Republic and various other countries to look at the way that children work in different industries, and really trying to challenge this notion that all child labour is necessarily exploitative, and the hazy lines between family life, child labour, education, all those kinds of things, just trying to kind of challenge some of those narratives around child labour a bit more critically and in a more contextually sensitive way. And then we're doing some ongoing work around the whole impacts of Brexit on children's well-being, poverty, child protection, as well as their immigration status. Another big feature of what we do in our faculty is access to justice. So we do a lot of academic research around access to justice for the most vulnerable, and we've transposed a lot of this into strategic litigation work. And by strategic litigation, we mean gathering research evidence and using research evidence to support big cases that go before the courts to try and change not just one child's life, but a whole cohort of children's lives. An example of that was a big case that we did around foster carers and the legal status of foster carers. And we gathered lots of evidence around children's experiences of foster care and whether it would be contrary to children's best interest to recognise foster carers as employees for the purposes of being able to register a trade union. And so we took that case all the way to the Court of Appeal, and it won in the Court of Appeal. And we've done a lot of witness statements around children's access to British citizenship and EU settlement scheme for EU nationals living in the UK, and how that's impacting on children's access to welfare benefits and poverty and disadvantage. So strategic litigation and gathering evidence has been a really important part of what we do. Our Liverpool Law Clinic specialises in education, in advice and representation for children. So we have one of the biggest advice services on special educational needs and disabilities in the country. It's one area where advice and representation isn't available readily for families, and it's not legally aided. So we do loads of kind of clinical work around that. But importantly, for the purposes of the N8, is we use research to inform that advice and representation as well. So there's a parallel strand of research and scholarship sitting alongside all of our clinical work, conducted by the very practitioners that are giving the legal advice and representation. We've also done a lot of work training lawyers, training judges, new methods of working with legal practitioners based on children's rights-based approaches to lawyering. And that piece of work on rewriting children's rights judgments was done with Catherine Hollingsworth at Newcastle University. The project at the bottom there, the TAIL project, was done with Save the Children and other organisations from across Europe. So we've developed an online training tool for lawyers who are working with children. And just that little bit on the side there, that's a vaccination nurse. We've developed some really comprehensive training around consent to vaccination based on all of our research on children's capacity to consent. And there's real possibilities, I think, to link this with other N8 partners' work around vaccination. What we find from our work with the nurses is that they were investing more time and more resources in actually getting consent from parents for COVID and HPV vaccination than they were actually administering the vaccination. And many thousands of children, especially teenage children from vulnerable groups, were going without any vaccination, HPV vaccination at all, because their parents either wouldn't consent or just couldn't consent for various reasons. So we've worked through a whole very comprehensive training program, and we've trained hundreds of nurses across the north on the law around consent and the possibilities of them pursuing children's consent on their own behalf. And we've worked through all of the case law and the kind of strategies to support children to give consent on their own behalf. And we really want to extend that to the whole of England if possible, but it would be really great if we could join up with other N8s, people working in the vaccination field to have this kind of socio-legal and health-based approach. And then there's obviously work within and across Liverpool. We have 4 universities in Liverpool. We have Edge Hill, John Moores, Hope, and then the University of Liverpool. And each of those universities offers something very distinctive in the area of children and childhood. So we've started to forge quite a lot of links with those in recent years. A couple of examples of that is a project that was led by Amel Algrani, and Lucy Frith was also doing this work on children's experiences of SEND support during the COVID period and how it specifically affected children with special educational needs. And that work is ongoing with those universities. And equally, you'll know that Liverpool is working towards becoming a UNICEF child-friendly city. So the 4 universities are working really closely to support that with a whole range of stakeholders across the city. That's been a more frustrating process, if the truth be told, but it has enabled us to forge some really good collaborative links with a whole variety of academic and non-academic stakeholders. Okay, so just to finish, I guess, here's our kind of gaps and weaknesses, I guess. There's lots and lots of things that we could say about potential kind of substantive synergies, but in terms of kind of our overarching gaps, you know, we need to really sort our ethics committees out in some ways and have some consistency and confidence in the way that we're all working with ethics committees that is beyond just the personnel who are in them. So that's consistencies across institutions, but consistency within institutions as well. But also we've been looking a lot at beyond ethics. We've been looking a lot at trauma-informed approaches to research that help kind of reflect trauma-informed, the fantastic developments in trauma-informed approach to practice and policy. And the kind of rationale for that is, if we don't have a trauma-informed approach to our research, then how can we possibly achieve really good trauma-informed practice and policy? So we've been looking at what that looks like in a bit more depth, but we don't know of a huge amount of work on trauma-informed approaches to working with children who have been through trauma or in traumatic situations. The other thing is kind of some methods innovations. We do loads and loads of participatory research, co-production, all of that stuff. We're less good on quantitative methods on our side of campus, and we're not very good at sharing that methodological expertise and training. And there's definite sense that there's quite a bit of training if you're, master's, PhD level, but then it sort of disappears into that training kind of disappears. Those training opportunities are not so available once you get to kind of more established academics. And I think that's where we feel there's potential there. I think in terms of early career, that there could be more. We have a huge amount of collaboration in our field of law or children's rights-based approaches, but we could probably do more to promote interdisciplinary collaboration across the N8 amongst very early career researchers, and just try and build that capacity, and even go back beyond that and think about how we're doing our teaching of children and childhood work at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Are there opportunities for some really interesting kind of cross-institutional and cross-disciplinary postgraduate courses? So that's just some thoughts as well as a few examples, and there's my contact details if you want any more details of any of the projects.
Thanks so much, Helen. That's brilliant. And once again, thank you in particular for picking up a lot of the research from your colleagues and showing the broad breadth of what's going on in your faculty. That's really useful. Anybody with any questions for Helen?
Can I just come in with a comment, or with a couple of comments? I mean, I think some people have also said it already in the chat, that the idea that you have this advisory group of young people or children and young people, maybe that is something to consider being part of a future N8 Child of the North strategy. It just seems to me to be the right kind of way to think about how when we develop new initiatives, how we can consult. I mean, in this pilot study that the colleagues and I did with students into student mental health literacy in the spring, this was really totally, in a sense, it was a consultation. We basically used a survey and focus group to ask students, do you think this research topic makes any sense? Does it make any sense to you, and how would you do it? Or is it even relevant to you? Or are we having a research idea that is completely off the mark from the point of view of your experience? So going further in that direction also as part of an N8 Child of the North strategy sounds really good to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is a good idea. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
I mean, I also could sympathize with some of the ethical issues. I think they are definitely something to look into, and I mean, I'm coming to that from different sides as well, because I used to chair a big ethics committee across 2 faculties in my university. So I'm also very aware of the issues actually that have to do with how ethics committees are being set up in universities, and maybe it's different in yours, but in the end, the trouble is that a lot of the colleagues who are on these committees, they are not really, well, they're being asked to be on the committee and review ethics applications, and they might not even know all that much, or they have to learn themselves to do it. But I think it's a really, really relevant in terms of being something that can potentially stop good research from happening. I mean, so again, maybe something to take up perhaps as a theme even for Child of the North, you know, the thinking around ethics in relation to research with children and young people? Because there might be other experiences also from the other universities. I'll better stop now.
Pam, your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on the ethics as well, because it's something that we feel we're having to do in our university. We're having to provide lots of documentation for the ethics committees to be able to make an appropriate decision. Like you said, you know, you've got to ensure that these children have a voice and that they are represented in research. And I do like the idea, if people within the N8 universities are having very similar experiences with ethics committees, us coming together and perhaps writing some documentation, so that, because I think what certainly we feel is our ethics committees feel it's just us that has an issue, whereas actually most researchers are battling this, and it would be really nice to be able to show that this is actually one voice, you know, and actually we all want to be working together and doing really good research and addressing key problems for young people. So yeah, so it was really great to hear all the stuff you're doing as well, Helen. You know, it's been really nice to hear what people have been up to, so thank you.
I think, Kamala, what you're saying, it's not just in the north either, it's like it's all over the place, and I think that the N8 could be a real leader on this kind of UK-wide. So yeah, sorry.
So I think this really rang a bell with me as well when you were saying something. So in a couple of ways. One is that in some of our other N8 programs, specifically one around a completely different area, but computationally intensive research, when they went out to the communities in various research areas to ask what their priorities were, they initially expected it was going to be around developing research collaborations, grants and things like that. And it turned out that overwhelmingly in all communities, the biggest request was for training and sharing of good practice, essentially. And that's really where they've taken that focus, because it's building on the resources that exists in individual universities and sharing it across the universities, or as you've just suggested, sort of developing new practices that can be rolled out across the universities. So that'll be a really strong strand of activity for the Child of the North to do. So I think that's really, really good. And the other one, which I have now temporarily forgotten, will come back to me in a minute. But any other questions for Helen? Okay, well, thanks again, Hannah. As I say, we will share the slides afterwards, so everybody have a copy of those. We've got about 25 minutes left, so we've got some time for some general discussion. What I'm going to do is I will pop the topics for discussion back up on the screen to see if that generates any more discussion. So again, just a reminder, with the sort of proposed aim for the future strategy of supporting recovery from the pandemic and other related shocks, including obviously the current cost of living crisis for children growing up in the North. What is it that you've heard today that could form part of that future strategy? What do you consider to be the most pressing priorities for us to work together, and also what barriers exist to our working collectively and how they might be overcome? And I think that discussion around ethics is a particularly interesting one in terms of a barrier. So if we can think of other ones that we might need to break down as collectively, that'd be really interesting for people to discuss that. So if anybody has any thoughts on any of those. Everybody's having a Wednesday afternoon slump. That's fine. I mean, the one thing I was going to pick up on, again, thinking about different strands of a future strategy, and again picking up on these various points in the last conversation, is this idea of a sort of information or an information strand and sharing strand. And there was a comment in the chat about mapping existing research questions and the evidence base that's being generated, which is a really interesting idea. It could be quite a huge undertaking, so it would need a clear sort of use case, if you like, or what we're trying to get out of it. I think, and that goes back to something that was raised during the last webinar as well, about sort of mapping the expertise and almost like a directory of expertise across the NA as well. So I think these sort of information resources, if you like, are starting to emerge as a clear theme of where, on top of research and policy engagement, whether there's real value to be added from working together. So I've picked that up. Question. I think there's some questions coming in on the chat. Sorry, just picking up these questions.
I mean, can I just come in again?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a sense repeating, but it seems to me that perhaps we have identified at least one theme that possibly could be of interest for a wider group of people who are coming to the other webinars, which is around the ethics of, specifically, I guess, Helen, also that's what I got from you as well, in the kind of research where you want to work really collaboratively and, you know, as almost co-researchers or partners with children, and where you find yourself in situations where also it's the children whose consent you need most, and actually not the parents. So, and sharing expertise in that, on that end, might not be a bad thing. I mean, I could see that as something, you know, a group could work on. It's obviously not the full strategy that you are looking for, Stephen. I know there are various other elements also that we discussed last time. For example, the question of, you know, are we going to do more research? Is there more research that is needed? How much should we actually rather focus on advocacy and policy making? And I mean, I think the emergence at the start of this all-party parliamentary group is perhaps also something we should think about a little bit more in terms of to what extent that could be a channel. What I still am unclear about, Stephen, is also about, you know, you mentioned this earlier as well, this kind of on the horizon, the possibility of some support or funding for any kind of activity. I think that's still a bit difficult also to think, you know, what kind of activity could that be that would be maybe, you know, that would also bring in a wider group of people and would be of interest to a wider group of people, but at the same time also produce something really of value with regards to the overall aim of the Child of the North. So I'm still a bit kind of unclear about that, but you know, I'm not expecting you to have the answer.
No, and I think it's a really fair comment. So I think there's a couple of, and this comes back to one of the questions, some of the comments in the chat as well about sort of face-to-face workshop and things, and that's I'm hoping that's where we'll go with this, is with we will start to coalesce around some themes, because there's also comments about this is, you know, incredibly broad and overwhelming, and I think that's the right, and I think we need to coalesce around some themes. And in terms of where activity could be pump primed, it could either be in order to push some of those themes forward, or it could be, so a funding scheme that we launched this year for the first time, and we're trying, as essentially a seed corn funding scheme that we're calling Collaborate, and at the moment it's focusing on net zero, but in future it could, for example, focus on Child of the North. Now this is funding a small number of communities to develop in particular areas and really build up a community across the NA and focus on rather than undertaking the research, particularly on building the community and building the research agenda. So an option could be that we go down that route and propose a future round of Collaborate that focuses on Child of the North. And I'd be interested in people's thoughts around how valuable a pump priming scheme or a seed corn funding scheme of that type would be, given that most universities have their own seed corn funding schemes, and how much a scheme that works across the NH and seeks specifically to build communities across the 8 universities or a subset thereof, and with other partners, how useful that would be to sort of get things moving, if you like. mean, maybe that's, I say that's maybe a question for a specific workshop when we're thinking about activities. But if anybody has any thoughts on that now, you're welcomed.
Sorry, can I just say, Steve, it seems to me that it's one of those things of learning by doing, and it might just be useful to maybe sort of say, well, we'll run a set of workshops on methods and ethics or something like that, that might include sharing experiences of working with a young person's advisory group at different levels, or working with or navigating the ethics process or something like that. And we could have a set of workshops where we all just kind of invite contributions, just, you know, a few things that are established. And I know that there'll be various sort of substantive issues that we want to kind of pursue collaborations with, but at least that's a kind of, there's the sort of fundamentals, aren't they, the methods and ethics. And if we can establish some sort of, not necessarily consensus, but a good sense of at least some baseline kind of standards, that would be a really, really helpful thing to do, even just to sort of offload a bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. No preconceived ideas about what form any of this, this coverage should take, and really want to be guided by yourselves in terms of what would work. So yeah, if as you say, that sort of learn by doing kind of approach of workshops in various areas to see what works and what builds from there, absolutely, we can support that. And
you know, we'd be really happy at Liverpool to sort of kick off with an initial event, maybe after Christmas or something, if that's easier. We could host something here and, you know, structure it around it, you know, a day or half a day's workshop or whatever. Yeah, no,
I think that'd be really useful. And I think, and again, there was a question in the chat about sort of how people get involved. And I think, you know, doing that, lowering that bar to entry, if you like, by just holding workshops where people can come along because it's an area of interest to them. Absolutely, yeah, very much in favour of that. So thanks for that. It's a really good idea. Any other comments or questions or thoughts? Okay, in which case, again, I thank Gert and Uta and Helen for their contributions. They're really useful. There will be, as I say, we'll circulate the copies of the slides afterwards, and also a recording of the session. In terms of next steps, we are currently arranging the date for the next of these sessions, which will hopefully be in early November. But we will let you know as soon as we have a date for that. And we will send you the details for that. And as I say, we're also looking at a date in the new year for a workshop to think in more broader terms about some of these strategy discussions. So again, we will keep you in the loop about that. But if anybody has any questions at all, I will just pop up my my contact details before we go. So we also have the institutional champions that I mentioned earlier. The names are on screen there as a good first point of contact, many of whom are here today. And finally, there is my email address if you want to drop me a line and contact me. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good afternoon, and I'll speak to you at the next webinar in the series in a few weeks' time. Thanks all.
Thank you, Stephen, for organising it all and getting us together.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and everyone else. That was great.
Thank you, Helen.
Bye.
You too. Take care.
Thanks, Gerd.
Thank you. Bye.